The Philly Prime Podcast. I'm Dave Schratweiser. This week, we're going to talk about the upcoming primary for the mayor's race in Philadelphia. It's about 6 weeks away. It's May 16th on a Tuesday, and no one better to talk about that than my former colleague at FOX29 Political, analyst there now, former political correspondent, man of many trades and talents, Mr. Bruce Gordon. Welcome to the show again, Bruce. Good to have you on.
Always a pleasure, Dave. Always a pleasure.
And, we like to sit around and shoot the, you and I all the time, as we used to do in the newsroom. Bruce.
There's a lot to be shot at, right?
Yes, there was. Size this up for me. We're about 6 weeks, almost 6 weeks away from the primary. We all know in Philadelphia, due to the registration of Democrats to Republicans 7-1, if you win the Democratic primary, pretty much you're the person to beat in the mayor's race. 6 weeks out, how are you seeing things shaking out right now?
Well, the good news and the bad news, I guess, and we've discussed this a little bit in the past, is that with the lack of real polling, that is to say, a media outlet going to a legitimate polling outfit and getting some real numbers to look at, we really don't know how things are going to any great degree. And in a way, that's probably a good thing. We spend less time talking about the horse race and more time listening to various candidates whom, under any other circumstance, we might ignore someone's policy proposals on this, that, or the other issue because, the latest poll came out and they're at 3 or 5%, and so you tend to ignore them because they've got no chance to win. Now, I think there's at least a chance that folks take a little closer look at some of the policy prescriptions and proposals that some of these folks have to offer. But look, it's a huge field. Yeah. I think most of these candidates, if not all of them, recognize this opportunity comes along once every 8 years. Not every 4, but every 8. Whoever gets this job will be re-elected, barring some absolutely catastrophic scenario. And even in that case, they may get reelected. I always make the point that Wilson Goode was reelected after Move. And so if you can get reelected after a tragedy and a disaster like that, hard to see what could derail you for a second term. So they get one shot at this every 8 years. Big field, a number of candidates who have legitimate resumes and backgrounds. And so I think it's anybody's game at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the only poll that's been out there is not really a poll, but it had Brown with 24%, Helen Gim and Alan Dom at 15, and Reinhardt at 12. But that's a little, not tainted, that poll, but it skewed a little bit because it was not done by an independent group at that point. But that's the only numbers I've seen out there in the last month or so.
Right. And it's interesting, Dave, you mentioned those numbers, and this is where I think there's a real problem with the way Philadelphia does its elections. As you know, the city of Chicago is in the midst of a runoff election for their mayoral primary. And one of the two candidates involved, of course, is Paul Vallis, the former head of the school system in Philadelphia. Well, their system, as is the case in many systems, is especially when, and this becomes important when you have a big field, if nobody gets 50% in the initial election, there's a runoff between the first candidate and the second candidate, first place and second place. And that is now what's going on in the city of Chicago. In Philadelphia, you saw those numbers there. It's entirely possible that whoever wins this Democratic primary could win it and do so with 30% or less of the vote. Yeah. And when you think about the relatively small group of people who vote in primaries, that's a pretty small group of folks to determine the next mayor of the city of Philadelphia. And so if I were king of the world, and God, that would be a dangerous thing. But if I were, I would have either a runoff or what they do in some places like Alaska, for example, and a ranked choice voting system where you might say, Dave Schratweiser has a fair amount of support, but those who aren't voting for Dave really don't like Dave for whatever reason. And so the person who finishes second has some more support as maybe a second choice. They're not my first choice, but I wouldn't mind if they were the next mayor. And there's a way of calculating that. And everyone, when they vote, puts down Dave is my first choice, Fred is my second, Sally is my third choice, and so forth. And as the candidates are bumped off the bottom finishers, their votes, their second place votes, are added to the candidates at the top until somebody finally gets to 50%. So you don't, in that case, need to do a follow-up runoff election. Either way, Philadelphia is going to wind up with a new mayor come January of next year, who in this primary maybe didn't get more than 30% of the vote, if that. And that's troubling to me.
And let's talk about turnout. We have an unbelievable crime problem in Philadelphia that's at least starting to trend down a little bit. The homicides are down. I think the shootings are down a bit. The carjackings are down, but still way too high. Still the number one issue, I believe, in this campaign. Schools are always an able. We had a whole water thing this week that was an issue, that kind of thing. Turnout is a key here. Do you think people will go to the polls in the primary, knowing what you and I know, that it's 7-1 Democratic? And if you're picking the guy or the woman here to be mayor, this is it in May.
Right. This is your last shot at it. Yeah. Boy, I hope so, Dave. It is absolutely disheartening to see how low voter turnout is in some of these cases, in some of these races. We know the stakes are incredibly high. The crime situation, as you say, is a real challenge, although you correctly note, and I checked these numbers just this morning, the number of murders year to date in the city of Philadelphia is down 13% this year compared to last year, and 8% down last year from the year before that. So still out of control, still an outrageously big problem and a real tragedy in every case. But the numbers are, in fact, trending in the right direction. Excuse me. Having said all that, the fact is the stakes are huge. And there are some communities in particular that simply don't get out to vote. Now, you can make the argument that they feel disenfranchised. They feel like no matter who they vote for, nothing changes. And they're not necessarily wrong about that in some cases. But that does drive turnout down. I think in a primary, the key is sort of getting your voters to the polls. Sherelle Parker, for example, has some strong union endorsements. There are other candidates, Helen Gim seemingly has the teachers union behind her. So if you can get these organized groups to be organized and actually get out to the poll, you can win with a relatively small group of folks. That's a shame, but that's the way the system works. That's the way things go. And so you would hope turnout would be high, but there's nothing that I've seen that suggests it's going to be anywhere near as high as it frankly should be, given the stakes.
The get out the vote is always important. John Doherty used to play a key role in that in Local 98, getting the vans and getting the apparatus to get people to the polls and things like that. He's been convicted. He's awaiting a second or third trial and sentencing, so he won't be there this time. How much of an impact do you think that has on the Democratic primary? Will 98 be as involved? That's a good question. Will the old, Bob Brady, is he as involved as he used to be in election day and getting things out, that kind of thing? Your thoughts on it?
My sense is that Brady in particular tends, and I think this probably makes sense, some of the party leaders, the party officials tend to steer clear of any kind of an endorsement. You've noticed, for example, that, not that most of these candidates, quite frankly, might want his endorsement, but Jim Kenney, for example, has not been out there endorsing one candidate or another. Look, there's no question that Local 98 used to have a significant amount of political power in this city, and that is down dramatically with all of the events that you've just laid out. But certainly the get out the vote, or GOTV, get out the vote operations remain massively important, because again, it's not a massive turnout. It is a targeted turnout. You know who you have to get out as a candidate to get your point across. And so you do that. I mentioned Jim Kenney a minute ago, and you brought this up a moment ago as well. The situation with the water department, the water crisis, or at least the water scare, we'll put it that way, recently was an interesting phenomenon from a political standpoint, because you saw a number of candidates, Derek Green certainly among them, going hard after Jim Kenney for his seeming lack of sort of being out there, being out front, and kind of leading the charge to say to the folks in Philadelphia, I'm the mayor, I'm in charge, I'm going to let the experts on water quality and water safety do their thing, but right up front, I'm going to let you know that I'm in charge and we will get this situation figured out. And when you don't do that, there's an opening for these candidates to criticize, and several of them have jumped in on that. Kenney doesn't seem, for whatever reason, to understand or care about the optics of this. And yes, you can poo-poo the optics and say, look, I'm not the real expert on this water crisis, so I'm going to let the real experts go front and center. That's not what people want. They want to know that their mayor is in charge. We saw it during COVID. For all of the later problems that Governor Cuomo had in New York, he was given great credit, perhaps even more than he deserved, for being out front and seeming to be in charge. And so the folks who are now the candidates have gone after Kenney because of that. And frankly, they understand it's a winning strategy. look, Jim Kenney went hard after Michael Nutter when he
Yep.
was running for office,
True.
and Michael
Yes.
Nutter went hard after John Street when he was running for office. Street obviously couldn't do that going back 3 cycles now because the mayor then was Ed Rendell. No one was criticizing Ed Rendell. And so if anything, it was all sort of the Rendell Street administration that he was touting when he was running for mayor. But in general, going after the incumbent mayor can be a good strategy.
Kenny's rebound from not being out front, kind of confrontational with reporters when he held a news conference about it. This isn't rocket science, stuff like that, those kind of comments. And then later in the day, declaring that the tap water was safe. And I believe he drank a glass of tap water to demonstrate.
Always a nice move.
Yeah, as such. Oh, optics, Bruce. Oh, that's a good picture. Let's have a good picture.
Right.
So, he kind of rebounded quickly, but definitely left himself open for criticism again.
Yeah, I mean, look, he is going to live. He's going to be spending the next 10 years living down the comment that he made to Fox 29's Chris O'Connell some months ago, where he made very clear that with all of the stuff going on around him, he would be thrilled the day he's no longer mayor. In other words, the message was very clear, whether he intended it this way or not. The message seemed clear that the job had gotten to him. The challenges, the daily crises, the daily challenges had gotten to him, and he was looking forward to the day when he would be no longer mayor. And that's certainly not the message you want to put out there. And that's unfortunately going to dog him probably for quite some time to come. But as I say, several of the candidates have gone after him on that front. We need real leadership, not someone who's reluctant to even want the job. We need real leadership, and that's what I will give you as voters. Real quickly, what's interesting about that premise of going after the incumbent, what I think is a strong point about it is that you tend to sort of ignore the other competitors, the other challengers. If you're the incumbent, Dave, and I'm going after you, what I'm basically saying is I'm elevating myself to your level. It's you, the incumbent, and me, Bruce Gordon, the challenger, even though you're not on the ballot anymore. You're term limited. You're out as of January. Right. But I'm going to compare myself to you favorably, of course, in my direction. I'm going to say what I would do better than you did, and I'm not even going to worry about the other challengers in the race. Now, you can't completely ignore them, but the idea of elevating yourself to the level of the incumbent and comparing yourself, as Kenney did to Nutter, as Nutter did to Street, is effective, especially when the mayor is not particularly popular, and Jim Kenney is not particularly popular.
All right, let's talk about ballot positions because it shifted a little bit. John Wood, a former police officer, was the number 1 spot on the ballot, but he's now dropped out, and Sherelle Parker is now number 1. Some of the spots, could be, I guess, troublesome here. Helen Gim is way down at the bottom at number 11. How much does that impact things on Election Day?
Well, there's a couple of interesting points there, Dave. I think, first of all, it is a bigger deal, I would argue, for example, a councilman at large position, right? That's where you're voting for as many as 7 different council at large positions. And it is a long list of candidates, often into the 20s of candidates who are looking for those positions. And naturally, you start at the top and you kind of work your way down the list. And as you do that, you say, well, yeah, I kind of like this candidate. And, yeah, this one's pretty good. And that one's pretty good. Next thing you know, you've gotten to your 7 and you may not go any farther than that. Hey, that's my 7. I'm out of choices and I'm pretty happy with these choices. Yeah. Meanwhile, the person who was 24th, 28th, 30th on that list never really gets a full assessment from you. Well, it's somewhat less troublesome in a mayoral race because you would like to think that there's some more name recognition and you would have at least a little better idea going into the booth on Election Day, who you want to win. So that brings us to the second issue, and that is that there's been some talk that Jeff Brown, the supermarket owner, has made some attempts to knock Amen Brown off the ballot. Right. Amen Brown is right before Jeff Brown, as I understand it, on the ballot position. And the last thing Jeff Brown wants or needs is for someone to say, yeah, I'd like Jeff Brown to win. Oh, there's Brown on the ballot. And they check the box. So to speak, and off they go. And in fact, it was quote unquote the wrong Brown who was voted for. So they've made some attempts at the moment anyway. Amen Brown looks like he has survived.
I think he said yesterday he's in. I think he said yesterday he's staying and he has no intention of going anywhere. So
Yeah, he's gotten some chastising from the judge who was looking into some of the financial disclosure forms. But as far as the signatures, the petition signatures, he appears to have survived those challenges. But
yeah.
that's a potential problem when you've got two guys with the same last name and they're right one after the other. There's going to be a little confusion there, and that's not going to help Jeff Brown, certainly.
All right, let's talk about TV ads. Has been a kind of a paucity of spending of money by the candidates other than Alan Dom and Jeff Brown. And now we see a little bit from Rebecca Reinhardt, and we'll get to that ad in a minute. But the person who's been out there the most is Alan Dom. Started first. He's had a couple of good commercials, one about crime with children in it, walking and talking with children about wanting to provide a better city for them, that kind of thing. This past week, he's come out with his pothole fixing ad, which I thought was very well done. I must give him his props. He's driving around in an older vehicle, bouncing through potholes, and whoever produced it.
And the bouncier the picture, right? The bouncier the picture, the better.
Whoever produced it and did the media work for him did a nice job, and ends it with him hitting a pothole after he finishes the ad. I thought that was well done. Jeff Brown, on the other hand, has spent money, which he has because he owns 5 or 6 supermarkets. He was there in the African-American community when no one else would put a supermarket in their neighborhoods. Even after the George Floyd situation and during the pandemic, he went out of his way to keep his stores open or get them reopened, that kind of thing. And he's harping on that kind of thing. His ads have been pretty good as well. Not as charismatic as some of the other candidates, I don't think. But what do you think of the ads? Just let's start with those two, and then we'll talk about the new Rebecca Reinhardt one.
Well, I think the Dom ad in particular, I've been seeing a lot of the pothole ad. Look, those kind of things can resonate. That's real basic stuff. But being able to just simply fill potholes, goodness knows, I did a fair amount of reporting over the years at FOX29 on this issue of kind of working on behalf of regular folks out there in these neighborhoods who had to live with streets that were torn up for literally months on end, in some cases years on end, after a construction project or just the basic wear and tear. And folks get really fed up with this kind of stuff. They figure this is the least my government can do. I don't expect my government, my city government, to be solving all of the problems of mankind, but for goodness sake, can you give me a road that I can drive on without breaking an axle? That seems to be the bare minimum. So I think that can be an effective kind of an issue for him to rise on. I do think that the Jeff Brown scenario is interesting because, of course, he's taken some shots for who he had in his ads, taking some criticism over an ad with Michelle Obama in it, where she's praising an initiative of his, and the implication is that she might be endorsing him. In fact, she's not endorsing anyone in this race, and so he's taking some shots there. Interesting, the Inquirer did a big blowout piece quite recently on the Jeff Brown situation. You mentioned these food deserts and him going into some of these communities. And I don't know, I guess I thought the story was interesting, but perhaps a little unfair. Brown undoubtedly has claimed probably more credit than he fully deserves for going to some of these neighborhoods, because in any case like that, there is all kinds of government help, government incentive programs to get business people to do this, tax breaks and so forth. And they legitimately point out that this was not purely out of the goodness of his heart. He got various business breaks and tax breaks to go into some of these neighborhoods. Still, nobody else was rushing to do it, and he did it. So, good on him for doing that. But he's taken a few shots, both in the Obama scenario and in the Inquirer piece, that suggested maybe he doesn't deserve quite the credit that he wants to claim for going into some of these neighborhoods.
All right, now let's talk about one that came out this week, a very interesting duo endorsing Rebecca Reinhardt, the former controller in the city, who knows her way around a number sheet and a spreadsheet, and has been quite effective in criticizing city government and suggesting things that would improve it, including the police department and other areas, streets department, etc. But this week, an ad featuring John Street and Michael Nutter sitting side by side, Bruce, two former adversaries, let's say. It's quite the interesting ad. Well done by both of them, I will say. And then Rebecca comes in at the end and kind of splits the atom in between the two of them and says, let's get back to work, and I thought it was well done, unexpected. And I'm wondering how much that moves the needle.
Well, of course, you have to like and respect and have some fondness for your memory of the street years and the Nutter years for it to truly work.
Yeah.
Um, so that's obviously the big sort of unknown quantity. What do people think of the two of them, and do they care about their opinions
Mhm.
now? X number of years after they've been out of office. It is interesting, and I thought somewhat effective in the sense of, as you say, getting two guys who did not agree on much
Right.
to appear in the same commercial. Street actually has something of a role in her campaign.
Hmm.
Nutter is simply endorsing her.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Nutter was relentless in his criticism of John Street when
I
he was
remember.
running for office. I guess it would have been about 16 years ago or so. Um, and in part, it was dealing with all of these issues of ethics, ethics complaints, and ethics investigations, and so forth. And Nutter did exactly what I talked about before, ignored the other candidates who included Bob Brady and Tom Knox, the businessman, and so forth, ignored them essentially, and made it about me, Michael Nutter, versus the guy who has the job now, John Street, and I'm going to
Hmm.
do a better job, and I'm going to be ethical, and we're going to be transparent from day one. So there was no love lost between these two guys for quite a number of years. And the
Hmm.
idea that they sort of bury the hatchet, if you will, and appear in the same commercial for Rebecca Reinhardt is at least theoretically a nice move on her part. Again, you have to like and respect these guys to care what their opinion is in the first place, but we'll
Yeah.
see how it works out.
All right. Do you think they have to step up the use of TV ads here? I know the TV stations in Philadelphia would like that. They make a lot of money on those ads, including FOX29, just because we both work there.
Sure.
Your thoughts? I mean, I think they need to get out there a little bit, starting like now, like April 1st is Saturday, I believe.
Yeah.
I think in the last 6 weeks, if that's what you're holding your money for, you better get going. So for some of these
Yeah.
candidates, if they're going to move up, and I'm talking about Maria Quinones Sanchez, Sherelle Parker, some of these others, and there's a lot more. I don't mean to purposely leave anybody out or anything like that. But
Right.
if you're gonna get across the finish line here, you got to spend some money.
Yeah, it's time to start separating yourself from the pack.
Yes.
And there are only limited opportunities to do so. Look, all these guys would like to do more television, I'm
Yep.
sure. They
Hmm.
understand the value of it. But frankly, it's expensive. I mean, there's
Yep.
no question about it. It is expensive to put these political ads on TV, to create them and then to run them over and over and over again. And anyone who does these ads will tell you, you can't simply run a sporadic ad here or there. You've got to really blanket the airwaves
Hmm.
enough to the point where some people will be annoyed and sort of sick of hearing them and seeing them. But
Yep.
you've got to really get them into what the radio stations might have called a heavy rotation, so to
Yes.
speak.
Hmm.
They got to be on the air over and over again for you to actually sort of pay attention to them. And that costs a lot of money. And some of these candidates simply don't have the money to do that. The other opportunity they'll have, of course, coming up on the 11th of April, you mentioned Fox 29, the
Yeah.
station will be hosting a debate among the candidates. And that is going to be another opportunity, one of the rare opportunities for these candidates to try to separate themselves from the pack, do or say something that
Yeah.
separates them. You
And let's
mentioned
be
about
clear, there's been,
TV.
there's been a whole bunch of forums on
Absolutely.
issues,
Yeah.
and they've kind of replaced the TV ad debate thing for now. Everybody was invited, I believe, to participate in those. But
Yeah.
the debate on the 11th on Fox 29, I think you're going to participate a little bit, not in the debate, but afterward.
Yeah.
How important is that for somebody to like land a punch here if they want to
Well,
move up?
it's hugely important.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was going to say about these commercials is that if you make a commercial that is clever enough, and certainly the ad, say with Nutter and Street, rose sort of to that level.
Yeah.
If you make an ad that's clever enough, you get the added benefit of not just the times you've paid to put it on TV,
Hmm.
but you got a TV station maybe to do a story about the fact that these two ex-mayors
Hmm.
who didn't really get along together with each other at all are
Yeah.
now teaming up in this new ad for this candidate or that candidate. So you get some free publicity that way. The newspaper writes a story about it. The Inquirer does a story about it. So if you make your commercial clever enough and interesting enough, you can get some free coverage. Similarly, in the debate, who knows how many people will watch the debate that night? Hopefully, lots of folks will tune in to see
Hmm.
and help make their decision, help inform
Yep.
their decision. But again, if you have that one liner, that zinger, that real needle mover of a performance, then you get some coverage in the days following that reverberates. The
Hmm.
TV show itself, the debate has come and gone, and that signal is on its way to Pluto. But you've gotten the coverage in the next few days, whether it's TV, radio, websites, the website for the campaign, picking and choosing little snippets to put on their site because you had a great one-liner that really knocked some other candidate for a loop. But you've got to do that because it's a crowded field. Just by definition, the logistics of it mean you're not going to get a whole lot of speaking time. So you better make every second count or you're going to get lost in the crowd. Right.
So it's the soundbite and then the bounce afterward that is the most important thing. And the soundbite drives the bounce.
Exactly. You've got to, and don't think for a minute that these folks aren't saying, okay, who do I have to go after, right? Who do I have to knock down? And you'll know early on, again, there's been no real public polling to speak of, but you'll know right from the beginning virtually who the candidates themselves think is in the lead, because this is the old line about, you got a bunch of crabs in a barrel and one of them starts to climb out and the others claw it back into the group. Whoever is the apparent leader, you're going to see the other candidates go hard after that candidate.
That's how we'll know the leader by who gets attacked the most, correct?
Exactly. But each candidate has to say to themselves, all right, who's the person I'm really most concerned about? All right, what's their vulnerability and what's the line? If I've got 30 seconds to go after them on their position on issue X, what's my line that's going to really resonate and that's going to stick? And people are going to say, wow, man, Gordon took him apart on that issue. That was a real zinger. We'll see.
And I'm assuming crime's going to be talked about a lot at this debate. I'm assuming the recent water situation is. Stop and frisk is probably going to be discussed. I noticed that a couple of forums, they were asking each of the candidates if they would keep Police Commissioner Outlaw. And if they weren't, who would you pick? Now, as a little card thrown into this, or the mayor vetoed a bill from council to start the position of a public safety director, and they quickly overrode his veto. No idea what that's going to look like, who that could be. I've heard some names thrown around about who might be the person for that. But again, we're going to have a new mayor. So we're going to be not only picking a police commissioner, but a public safety director, if that's still in play at the time. So those things are going to come up at the debate, and you better have an answer.
Well, and we've already seen one ad in which one of the candidates is criticized for saying one thing to one group of people, another thing to another group of people. Because let's face it, when you talk about crime in particular, that is a huge issue. This idea of saying to one community, we need way more police to crack down on the lawlessness in the city. And in another neighborhood, they hear that and they interpret that as, great, an occupying army of police officers who are already treating some of our young people poorly, and now they want more police and more funding for police. It's a real issue, and you can debate the fairness of it on either side, but it's a real issue that what one community wants in terms of policing is not at all what another neighborhood wants in terms of policing.
Okay. Let's finish this up, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot here or anything like that. Your thoughts right now. Do you have a front runner, Bruce Gordon? Do you have 2 or 3 people you think are at the top? Do you have somebody who's rising quickly that you're keeping an eye on? Give us a little bit of that, and we'll end this. But I'm curiously, you watch these things on a daily basis when you're not traveling around the world. But just your thoughts.
I'll be honest with you, and this will sound like the ultimate cop-out. I have no idea who's going to win. I'll tell you that right up front.
Neither do I.
I think what I would say is that based on the usual metrics, that is, who's getting the big endorsements, which again in a primary scenario suggests that they will have a better than average get out the vote operation and the organization behind, say, a big union. You have to look at someone like Helen Gim with the teachers' support. You have to look at Sherelle Parker in terms of her ability to get some of the building trades and some of the other big unions that are important in the city behind her. You have to look at candidates who have the money to get their message out. Doesn't necessarily mean they're the best candidates, but they're getting their message out. They're building their name recognition. And so when you look at that issue, you're talking about someone like maybe a Jeff Brown or an Alan Dom. So there are a handful of candidates at least. Rebecca Reinhart, certainly based on her resume, has to be taken seriously. Here's someone who was in the Nutter administration and then has looked at the city's finances as the controller and has real sense of, on a department by department basis. One of the comments made by guys like Street and Nutter in these ads is, this is someone who could hit the ground running on day one, because they have gone through department by department. Here's what's wrong with your department. Here's what you could do to fix this. Here's what you could do to fix that. So that resume certainly resonates. So I say all that to say that there are probably, of the 11 or so candidates out there, there are probably at least 5 who could make a legitimate claim to being in that sort of top tier. And that takes us right back to what I talked about up top. And that is that it would not shock me if the winner of this thing has no more than 30% of the vote. But it could be, and when it's that low, again, it's hugely important you get your voters out there. You don't need 50% of the total vote. You need your 30% to get out and vote. And if you're organized enough and have the money and the resources, you can do that.
And I think I heard former Mayor Nutter this week say, there's been 99 male mayors in Philadelphia, not a woman. It's time for a woman. And I think that's part of his decision-making on backing Rebecca Reinhardt. And I think there's quite a bit of sentiment for that as well. And as you can see that by the number of female candidates in the race this time. So, we'll see if that holds any sway. I don't want to slight the Republican candidate here in the Republican primary. That's David O, correct? The council person?
It is. And look, the good news.
Close this out on David.
Well, the good news is that for the first time in a while, we've got an actual Republican running. David O is a legitimate Republican, not a disaffected Democrat who the Republican Party was able to convince to run to be sort of a sacrificial lamb. He's hardly the first real Republican, we'll say. But we've seen a few examples of disaffected Democrats running as Republicans. So it's good to see a legitimate lifelong Republican with a different perspective on city government running. Look, back in the day, you had guys like Sam Katz who were giving John Street a legitimate run for his money. It was hardly a nail biter, but it wasn't this sort of, 80-20, 85-15 kind of wipeout that we've seen in current years. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it is always, at least in my view, better to have a legitimate two-party system where there's real debate between parties and not one party so dominant that there's really very little discussion, very little debate in a big picture way over the direction of the city. So David O is a legitimate candidate with legitimate experience in council. As I say, a real Republican. And so hopefully he can at least get the issues out there. No one's kidding themselves that he's going to win the election in November, but he can hopefully at least get some of these issues on the table and make the eventual winner, as Al Taubenberger once said, make them a better candidate because of the issues he's bringing to the table.
And politically, I'm speaking here, it'd be nice if he took the gloves off a little bit and didn't let the Democratic candidate just walk to the finish line, that he would bring out the key issues, get that candidate to make some statements that voters and the public could then revisit with them if they're not doing the things that they promised to do. And it'd be nice to see David O go up against whoever the candidate here is and hold their feet to the fire. And
absolutely
not just the public, but public figures who are saying, you said this and you better deliver.
Right. A real debate with real ideas. And, we'll see if that happens, but I have at least some hope that David O can do that and make a real contest out of this with a real exchange of ideas. We'll see.
Looking forward to the debate on FOX29 coming up in April. Bruce is going to be doing some, political analysis after the debate is over. So look forward to that. We're going to have him on again after the debate and leading up to the election, and probably right after the election, talking about the winner and the race in the fall. But Bruce, I always appreciate you coming on. Great insights as usual, and continue to monitor the race and keep us up to date.
I will do so, Dave. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, my friend.
All right, good to see you again. That's it for the Philly Prime podcast for this week. Thanks for listening. We appreciate that, and tune in again next week.